There's a market within indie scenes for remarkably watered-down versions of music derived from non-Western cultures, not always being an acceptably inspired version, but rather the same but a little bit flimsier. Zach Condon's band may be the indie teenager's introduction to Balkan brass folk music with odd titling reminiscent of a completely different location, but at least the imitation felt sincere, and as if Condon was very in delight upon reminiscing upon these sounds and settings. Not a half-hearted imitation, but wholehearted instead, introducing me at age 15 to life-affirming musical arrangements and a baritone voice peppered with vibratos that sounds either like a bold call to the seeping shoreline or a very cold barber in an independently produced opera. Compositionally, these guys may be the biggest one-trick pony, and I think their debut album is a little bit muffled by the pale imitation of a far richer cultural sound. But the Flying Club Cup and the Riptide, which came after, refined that for something catchier and totally wonder-instilling. Am I listening to an indie mix on Spotify in the uni library, or have I emerged upon the wharf overseeing crashing waves against sidling rocks on the coastline? I can't tell. I can't be the only person who believes something like this is the perfect music to hear in a lively festival, or the buskers off in the distance near the farmer's market or something.
A Sunday smile we wore it for a while, and that's
I'm definitely not the first person to infer that their 2015 album, No No No, a take on their stylistic fusion with indie pop, is the first album in human history to be capable of reviewing itself by simply mentioning the title. Perhaps my issue with Beirut over time wasn't really their slightly misleading name, but how predictable their songwriting is. A bulk of it sounds a lot like hymns, ones which rely on looping about as much as Taj Sultana, and because of that, whether or not I connect with the song depends on whether the polyphonic melodies in tandem sweep me up emotionally, because if they don't, I usually treat it with the same sneering neglect that I do with the shepherd's pie special at my old high school's tuck shop. The same shepherd's pie they served in a paper cup, microwaved for 5 minutes and still ended up cold under the pillow of lukewarm mashed potatoes. That's not totally an offhanded tangent. Beirut tend to reheat their few ideas in the same unsettling way, so it makes sense that Gallipoli begins as standard fare but with a bolder return to the life-affirming melodies and arrangements that made their brass-based anthems so powerful. It places you directly in a specific time and location as if it was conceived in that particular place, and it was. As usual, it's significantly achieved with a very triumphant and outspoken section of the standard orchestra. We call that shit horny on main. And thankfully, it's not as if the songs begin with decent sounds and then fail to do absolutely anything with them for the remainder of the track length, much like the new Panda Bear album. These songs here definitely have places to go. Condon tends to name his songs not based on the subject matter, but rather after the place that he wrote it. So if you sift through this track listing hoping for a historical epic, you might be perturbed to discover the song fronts on more of a geographical index. Each song doesn't really speak of their places lyrically, but rather attempts to recreate the sound and spirit, and this is ultimately what makes Gallipoli feel so lavish in spite of its recyclable songwriting shortcomings. Gallipoli runs itself into an exhausted and slightly unhealthy state over time, like a jogger on hunger strike. They soon answer my prayers as Corfu hops in with its seductive crawl, led by the chromatic descent of piano chords every cluster of bars. It's a subversively dark turn, a lot like something from a Tricky record. The album from this point onwards takes an oddly transcendent turn, albeit continuing to employ similar sounds and songwriting to everything prior. It's slightly refreshing, even if by the point with songs like Light and the Atoll, you sort of wish it'd be cut down on if they plan on keeping their sound so relaxed. Well, as relaxed as you can be hearing the bittersweet screeching on Mainau Island. I imagine that track being a bit of a polarizing one. I mean, I liked it, but then again I find the noise my printer makes vaguely relaxing. Gallipoli is a nice album, although it's also a passive one, perhaps a 6 out of 10 for me. It's a lot like a homemade kite, a bit rustic and aesthetically pleasing, ready to take off to the skies. The issue is that it never does. Those kites never did.